The headline hit like a thunderclap. CEO calls off wedding. Cameras snapped, phones lit up, and a hush fell over the ballroom before anyone could even understand why. People expected a meltdown, tears, accusations, a public implosion. Instead, what followed was something no one saw coming, and everything that led to that stunned silence started long before the press conference lights turned on. Jian and Jian were not the kind of sisters who grew up with silver spoons or family crests. Their bond was forged in kitchens and tiny apartments, in late-night sketches and whispered promises. They called themselves sisters because blood had nothing to do with it. Adoption papers had made them family on paper, but a string of shared misfortunes and victories had cemented them as sisters in the only way that mattered. Jian, the older by 3 years, could sketch a dress in 5 minutes and turn it into a headline. Jian could feed a neighborhood for a week with the flavors of her broth and still find time to keep the books tidy. Together, they had turned scraps into a small empire. Jian's fledgling design label that began on a laptop, Jian's private kitchen that started as an idea scribbled on a napkin during a late-night fitting. They'd made a bargain when Jian signed her first small contract. Follow me and you'll never go hungry. It was a promise wrapped in sass, acceptance, and the grit that had carried them through foster homes, impossible landlords, and 1,000 little humiliations. Their mother, an older woman with a soft voice and a sharper tongue, the kind who could scold and soothe in the same breath, had stuck by them. So had an aunt who loved the spotlight a step too much, and who could be as supportive as she was tactically cruel. Those voices would matter later when pressure mounted, but for now they were background, a chorus that applauded every runway win and every sold-out supper. Success came in increments. Jian's collection, first shown in a cramped loft with string lights and 30 curious friends, caught the eye of a Shanghai boutique buyer who liked the raw edges and the confidence sewn into the garments. Word spread. She began to win small competitions, then larger ones, and soon she had investors asking for meetings. Jian's private kitchen, the place where friends were fed and contracts were celebrated over slow-simmered stew, became a culinary rumor among food journalists and tastemakers. Their lives began to tilt into a new orbit. Invitations to charity dinners, brand collaborations, and the kind of social Saturdays they'd only once seen in magazines. That new orbit intersected with the Zhou family in an awkward twist of fate. Zhou Shijeng, the heir and then CEO of Zhou Group, someone the papers called poised and immaculate, met Jian at a charity auction where she had donated a dress. The meeting was quiet, understated. Two people with complicated lives who noticed each other across a room. Not everyone understood it. Some saw a strategic alliance, a respected CEO marrying a rising designer. Others, closer to the sisters, saw something simpler and truer. Laughter that matched, late-night calls that lasted, a steadying presence in the chaos of building a life from scratch. Zhao Xiyang, a younger brother, was storm and speed, an impulsive racer with a golden temper. He liked loud motorcycles and louder opinions. Where Xizhang walked like a man who measured the tilt of every hour, Xiyang thundered through rooms and left conversations in his wake. He married into the family earlier. His marriage had its own rocky turns, but those were another story. The Zhao house, a stately, pressure-polished place, became strangely warm when the sisters entered. There were investments, little ones at first, money to fit a boutique window, a graceful loan to remodel the kitchen that turned Jian's private menu into a small, respectable restaurant with real chairs. People noticed when a designer who once sewed in borrowed light suddenly stood next to a CEO at a gala. There was power in that image, and the tabloids, which live off the friction between desire and propriety, began to circle. At family dinners, the conversation shifted. Auntie, who had always had an eye for upward motion, thought a public wedding would be perfect. They belong on a red carpet, she said, polishing the idea the way she polished silver. Mother worried about appearances in class, and her worry often came in the form of practical suggestions passed as concern. The sisters navigated those rooms with practiced smiles. They learned what to accept and what to shield. Love, to them, had always been practical as well as passionate. You supported each other, you took risks together, and you kept the other's dignity intact. The first crack came like a rumor at a dinner party, small, then contagious. It started on social media, where someone posted grainy images of Zhao Shizhang at a coffee shop with a woman not his fiancée. The timing was perfect, a string of paparazzi shots, an editorial that implied an old muse, and a headline that suggested betrayal. The photos were cropped, brightened, captions spun into certainty. By morning, the story had multiplied. Commenters, bloggers, late-night hosts picking through the pixels for motive and malice. That was when the sisters realized how thin the line between public adoration and public execution could be. Jian Yue's inbox flooded with messages, concern, speculation, disgust. Jian Xin stood poised in the restaurant kitchen, knife in hand and outrage in her chest, watching the comments rise like steam. "They can try to burn us," Jian Xin said, rolling her shoulders and sending orders out through the pass, "but we'll keep the doors open." Family pressure compounded the insult. Mother, who prioritized stability, read op-eds aloud like fate. "People will say you married up. People will say they never loved you." Aunties started whispering about the optics, about whether the wedding should be postponed, about how it would look if the Zhou name hosted a scandal. The sisters felt the weight of 1,000 speculative gazes. For every friend that offered quiet comfort, there were 10 strangers laying judgment. Zhang Ye retreated into the studio, fingers stained with fabric dye, mind working through silhouettes and statements, as if she could thread her dignity back on her own shoulders. The press took a side, then another, then a third. Some outlets ran with the love story angle, tragic misunderstanding, while others fed the worst suspicions. A talk show host framed the debate like a tennis match, betrayal or media misfire. The industry called. Investors in Zhang Ye's brand phoned for reassurance. Jian Xin's restaurant saw a drop in reservations. Rumor is an invisible toxin, and cautious diners stayed home. Then came the tampering. It didn't happen all at once. First, there were whispers that a photo of Zhu Shizheng had been enhanced. Then a blogger posted side-by-side images, showing the same coffee cup, the same hand, but different metadata. The sisters hired a digital forensics person out of private funds, an expensive but necessary choice. The analyst called with a clipped, clinical voice that hid the gulf between disbelief and certainty. Metadata mismatches, layers in the image that suggested compositing, timestamps that didn't align with GPS ping records. Someone had built a narrative out of pixels. Facing manipulated images is one thing. Facing a tidal wave of moral outrage is another. "They can Photoshop a life," Janya said into her phone, a tremor of anger and strategy. "But they can't Photoshop what we've earned." She began to prepare, stitching together a response that would not be defensive in tone. She wanted to be authoritative, because authority restores trust in the face of doubt. They did what most people would: gather evidence, prepare statements, brief counsel. Zhou Group's legal team moved quietly, issuing a demand for a retraction and an apology to the outlets that had run the image without verification. There were threats of lawsuits, big words that meant big bills and bigger headlines. The sisters watched as a courtroom drama that hadn't yet begun arranged itself on the horizon. Pressure invites opportunism, and opportunism brought sabotage. At first, it was petty. An anonymous Yelp review that complained about a strange smell at Jian Xin's restaurant. A bad social post about hygiene. Then someone laced a batch of soup, the one dish the restaurant was known for, with a bitter, harmless chemical that ruined the batch and sent a customer allergic to panic. It wasn't life-endangering, legally speaking, but that was the point. It would read like negligence, and negligence, when publicized, can bust a restaurant faster than a failing Instagram campaign. The chef on night duty called Jian Xin in hysterics. "It's the stock pot," she said. "Someone did something to the broth." They dealt with it the way practical people do: call the supplier, test the samples, close for a discrete day to clean and rebuild trust. That one night of quarantine cost them money and reputation. The next morning, a vlogger with an audience the size of a small city posted a sensational clip with a title designed to provoke panic. "Is this restaurant safe?" Comments multiplied like weeds. The sisters suspected sabotage, but suspicion requires proof, and proof needed incentive. Who would orchestrate such a campaign against two women who, by most measures, hadn't threatened anyone's bottom lines? There were economic motives, competing designers, jealous restaurateurs, but none of those motives had the scale or the access the evidence suggested. The scratches on the surface of a well-targeted attempt hinted at someone with knowledge of media cycles, someone who could sow a scandal and watch it unravel in the feeds. Then the kidnapping unfolded, live, clumsy, and humiliating in a way that felt tailored to cause panic. It began midday when Jian assistant, a young manager who ran supplies, failed to return a scheduled delivery. Her phone pinged once from a number labeled unknown, then died. A live stream showed a shaky, badly lit room and a masked figure who demanded a ransom for the woman's release, broadcasting the code word and shaking a bag to suggest danger. The feed was low quality enough for the algorithm to flag it and not yet trigger emergency protocols, but it was raw enough for viewers to loop the same shaky footage into 1,000 speculation threads. People tagged the sisters, the Zhao family, old lovers, everyone and no one. Panic is contagious. The restaurant's reservations fell twofold. Investors called to defer meetings. The Zhao household turned tense, first with whispered fears, then with logistics. Yang called the sisters in anger, less at what had happened than at the optics. "You're exposing everyone to risk," he barked over the line. "Why would you let this happen?" His voice was the kind that wanted an answer he could fix, not the kind that could sit with the intangible nature of modern humiliation. The sisters, older in ways that had nothing to do with numbers and everything to do with nights awake and decisions made, refused to cower. They hired private investigators, reached out to contacts within social platforms to request the takedown of the livestream, and traced the IP addresses, which looped through cheap proxies and a ring of disconnected Wi-Fi nodes. The trail was messy, deliberately so, but one thread remained: a delivery man's face caught on a neighbor's camera, a fleeting glimpse that matched an image pulled from a debtor's forum. It was the kind of lead that didn't hand you a villain on a silver platter. It gave you a starting point. A police report was filed. The masked figure turned out to be a small-time thug who had been hired by people desperate for cash and hungry for clicks more than cash. He had been paid a fraction of what the live stream earned in viral views. He turned in a tight, fearful testimony. He'd been approached by someone who promised a cut, handed a script, and told to get in front of the camera and scream. The mastermind, he said, was someone who wanted to shake them up. But a rural petty criminal rarely knows who pays the bill. He knows only faces and voices from the local underbelly. The investigators dug deeper and uncovered transfer records to an intermediary account. The money trail headed towards a name that ticked the sisters' teeth, someone on the edge of their world: Lin Xiaoyu. Lin was a complicated presence in Jian Yu's past, once an uncertain friend, later a rival designer who had crossed paths with Jian Yu at fashion incubators and at events where flattering words could slip into thin knives. In public, Lin was articulate and poised. In private, she'd been seen trading barbed compliments that said, "Watch your back," while nodding in a way that promised trouble. When investigators asked Lin about the transfers, she stuttered and produced screenshots that suggested blackmail. Her bank records showed money flowing in from an unknown account that had threatened her with exposing a secret, an old relationship, something that could be turned into a scandal if mishandled. She had been squeezed. She had taken the money to quiet the threat, she said, and had assumed it was a freelance gig for some agency. She had no knowledge that the stunt would involve kidnapping or manipulated photos. She cried in the interview, then asked for a lawyer. The footage was messy, full of motives folded inside motives. It didn't give anyone a clean villain. That ambiguity is where modern scandals live, in the gray spaces between intent and action, between a manipulated image and the human story behind it. The sisters felt the squeeze. They wanted accountability, and they wanted a narrative that would not feed on their pain. Jian Yu wanted to keep building her brand without being defined by another person's smear. Jian wanted to keep feeding people and the dignity that came with honest labor. Both wanted to avoid the spectacle that turns private shame into public entertainment. The sisters began to fight back in the only ways that made sense for them, methodically and loudly enough to be heard. They gathered the compromised files, hired digital forensics to authenticate every photo that had been used against them, and to dismantle the layers of manipulation. They subpoenaed data, requested raw files, and confronted outlets that had run the scoop without committing to verification. Zhao Group's counsel sent a crisp legal letter accusing the reporters of reckless reporting. A few outlets issued blurry, non-committal corrections. The journalist who had first posted the images issued a post admitting error, but it read like a half apology written by someone who feared the malice of their own clicks. There were quieter forms of attack too, the kind that operate on soft power. Auntie called late one night, in a voice that had always been equal parts pride and negotiation. "You two must be careful," she said. "People will say you married into money. They will finish you." There was a pinch of envy, her own ambitions grander than her means, but also a sincere fear that everything they'd built could be shredded by rumor. Mother, meanwhile, fell ill, angina that flared under stress, and that became another complication. Health matters in the family took on new gravity when the headlines refused to settle. Through it all, the sisters held on to each other. They kept dinners small, practiced rehearsed answers for cameras, and avoided the inevitable pitfalls of saying something that would be twisted. "We stick together," Jian said one evening, tailoring a statement that would be both firm and vulnerable. "Not because we need the Zhao name, because we chose this life together." It was the kind of line that would read well when a quoted tweet carved it into 1,000 variations. And there was one more arena to fight for, the design bid. An international conglomerate was putting together a multi-brand showcase, a career-defining contract that would catapult a small label into global distribution. Jian had entered the bid months earlier, her sketches lauded in private calls and her samples eyed by buyers. Now, with her reputation punctured by those manipulated images, the bid looked fragile. If Jian lost this contract, the fragile future she was stitching together could fray into something else entirely. That was when Jian decided to refuse the script the world seemed intent on writing for her. If the press wanted a spectacle of humiliation, she would give them something else, a demonstration that the force used to break you could be turned into a stage to rebuild you. She announced she would still attend the bid presentation, and in an unexpected twist, would walk the final runway herself. The thought alone was a kind of defiance. No model, just the designer, bare face, raw nerves, and the clothes she had made to speak back to doubt. It was a gamble, one that required more courage than sense to pull off, but courage had always been their currency. The CTA that follows a pivot like that is the kind that matters on social feeds. People like to watch a comeback. If you love stories about people taking their worst moments and making them stepping stones, hit like, because this one spirals into something wild. The sisters needed supporters, and in a world where attention is a resource, aligning new supporters mattered.
The runway decision was only one of many small rebellions. The legal team had begun to force retractions from outlets, and Zhao Group quietly began to assemble a public defense that would not be a crushing counterattack, but a clearing of the facts. Surveillance footage from near the coffee shop was pulled and compared with phone GPS pings. A discrepancy in the coffee shop photo's metadata suggested a different timestamp than the one the paparazzi claimed. A freelance photographer who'd sold the image swore he'd been set up with a special shoot. The investigation dug into that list of intermediaries and found a pattern of hired contractors who operated in the gray spaces between legitimate PR and scandal-making. Even as evidence mounted, the sisters had to handle the immediate fallout, a sudden drop in revenue, a barrage of comments on old, irrelevant posts, and an endless loop of speculation that made private life feel like a public amusement park. Yet there were small, tender moments that kept them anchored. John Shin in the kitchen testing a new broth to soothe the family breakfast. Jian Ye sketching a dress with a sleeve that echoed the curve of their mother's hands. Those little scenes were their breathing, proof that beneath the headlines, life continued, messy and human. Then a leak threatened to undo their progress. Someone in the Zhao household, likely well-meaning but misinformed, told a tabloid that Xi Zhang planned a grand wedding to put the scandal behind them. A wedding, the tabloid said, was the perfect solution to scandal. The image of commitment would drown out accusation. The story spread, and photos of invitations began to circulate, each caption less about celebration and more about optics. There was pressure on the bridesmaid list, on guest allocations, and on the sisters to perform stability when they felt anything but. It was in the middle of this that the legal team uncovered something that jolted everyone awake. A cache of raw images, unprocessed and timestamped on a drive that had been handed over to a junior editor at a gossip site. The raw images didn't match the published ones. Layers inconsistent with the original camera files hinted at manipulation. A forensic report suggested the published image had been edited in ways that appended a figure into the frame, making a meeting appear more intimate than it was. Someone had constructed a narrative out of fragments. Armed with that, Jian Group filed a formal complaint demanding corrections and an apology. The legal motion was not theatrical, it was methodical. The media outlets that had rushed to publish without verifying pulled down their posts. Some wrote hesitant corrections, others did not respond. The narrative shifted. The story that had turned Jian Ye and Jian Xin into victims of rumor began to tilt toward the story of a manufactured scandal. Public sympathy gathers like hail when the wind changes, but it's never guaranteed.
There was a small victory that felt like a lamp in a storm. At Jian Xin's restaurant, the first weekend after the corrections were posted, a table of young designers, rivals and friends alike, came in and raised their glasses. They toasted the sisters' resilience. "You didn't fold," one of them said. And in that room, with steam rising and laughter threading the air, the sisters felt something like normalcy return. But the wounds were not only public, they were private and sharp. Mother's heart trouble flared again under the weight of long nights and whispers. Auntie fretted about investment decisions made weeks ago, wondering aloud whether being visible in a high-profile family had been folly. Romance, too, had become complicated. The imagined image of a white dress and a carefully orchestrated ceremony sat against a backdrop of lawsuits and uncertainties. The narrative the public wanted, a tragic, quick scandal with a simple villain, didn't match the messier, more human truth. And then came the crucial piece that changed the tempo. CCTV footage from a street corner that captured a man handing a USB stick to a courier. The timestamp on the footage matched a gap in the freelance photographer's schedule. The courier, identified, led to a small studio rented by someone with ties to a boutique PR shop, notorious for its willingness to produce buzz by any means necessary. The trail wove through contractors, through a list of people who had been hired for creative solutions before, solutions that, in hindsight, might cross ethical lines. What had once looked like a lonely smear now began to look like a campaign, an engineered smear with a budget and a plan. Evidence is rarely tidy in real life. It's a quiver of fragments you have to put together like bone. The sisters did just that. They connected the dots, pressed for subpoenas, and watched as the campaign unraveled in publicity the way a cheap seam comes apart, threads exposing motives and relationships. Lin Sha Yu's name surfaced again, but this time with context. Her accounts had received funds. Her legal defense said she was coerced. A payment chain suggested a third party with a grudge and deep pockets. As the investigation closed in, the pressure in the Zhu household reached a new pitch. Jian, who had been a careful, composed figure through all this, found himself in a political position he hadn't planned for. He could let the scandal continue and hope it died down, or he could take decisive action. The optics of both choices were heavy, and the press, which survived on the currency of drama, smelled an ending. Would it be reconciliation or catastrophe? It's important to say that public figures move not only with private motives, but with advisors who worry about market reactions, brand value, and shareholder confidence. Jian's world was a boardroom and a ballroom at once. Every emotional choice rippled into quarterly reports. He convened a private meeting with the family, an action that turned into more than familial counsel because the Zhao name carries institutional weight. He also met privately with Jian Ye and Jian Xin, brief and formal, the kind of meeting that says everything when it says nothing. "I will not let the company suffer," he said in a voice that was equal parts apology and strategy. "But I cannot let this continue without action." In private, he was quieter than in public, and that quiet held a decision. He was someone who measured consequences. Now he had to weigh loyalty against legacy. And then the rumor that would dominate headlines began to congeal into possibility: a cancellation. There were whispers that Xi Zhang might call off the wedding. There were reasons a man in power might do that, perhaps to protect his fiancée from continued media drag, perhaps because he wanted to take responsibility publicly for letting the scandal become a spectacle, perhaps because a dramatic gesture was the only thing that might stop the churn of rumor and gossip. Some counselors argued for silence, others argued for spectacle. It's a curious truth that sometimes a decisive, even painful public action can reset a narrative in ways 1,000 apologies cannot. The sisters watched these recalibrations with mixed emotions. On one hand, a call-off could be validation, an admission that the forces arrayed against them had in fact hurt the relationship. On the other hand, it could play into the tabloid's appetite for melodrama, turning private heartbreak into a headline. They had to decide whether to be actors in someone else's story or authors of their own. One night, as rain skittered against the studio windows, Jian and Jian sat across from each other at a small table. Jian had a stack of designs splayed like a fan. "If he does call it off," she said, fingers tracing a seam, "I don't want pity. I don't want spectacle. I want clarity. If we end this, if the world ends the engagement, then we will end it on our terms." Jian smiled, the kind of smile that is both promise and dare. "Then let it be our statement," she said. "Not a collapse, but a pivot." They wrote press notes in rough, tactical scribbles, phrases that emphasized dignity and autonomy. They rehearsed answers that refused to reduce their lives to a headline snare. But before they could deliver any of that, the world had a way of accelerating. The media smell intensified as more outlets got wind of an internal decision brewing. People began to stake their reputations on predictions. The rumor mill churned into speculation about whether the cancellation would be protective, an act of a man shielding his bride from harassment, or punitive, a public renunciation of a flawed and fragile relationship. Whatever the motive, the possibility of a public cancellation turned the story from scandal into spectacle.
And spectacle favors extremes: the weeping, the rending of garments, the melodramatic farewells. The sisters refused that script. They prepared instead for an announcement that could go either way. As investigators closed in on the middlemen behind the smear, the sisters' lives took on an odd quality of being both publicly wounded and privately determined. They began to see that in modern scandal, power could be reclaimed not only by denouncing the falsehoods, but by stepping forward and creating new truths. A runway walked by a designer whose name had been dragged through the dirt is a kind of testimony. A restaurant full of diners who trusted the broth is an act of faith. Evidence presented in an orderly, calm way is dignity with a legal backbone. And yet, the world is impatient. People prefer the dramatic to the forensic. They want a clear villain, a theatrical apology, a tragic music swell. The sisters had none of that to offer, only the messy, patient work of clearing their names and rebuilding trust. The story of the manipulated images and the staged YouTube kidnapping was not a single villain's handiwork. It was a network of fear and opportunism, coercion and greed. That complexity made it harder to tell, but not less true. In the last days before the rumored announcement, friends rallied and careers pivoted. Jian secretly accepted an offer for a joint distribution deal, contingent on a clean public record. Jian negotiated a pop-up collaboration with a celebrity chef who vouched for their safety. They accumulated allies in the places that mattered: critics who believed in craft, journalists who liked evidence, and a few brave influencers who posted measured support. The tide subtly shifted from suspicion to curiosity with teeth. On the morning the world would later call the most consequential, the sisters got a brief private call from Shishang's assistant, saying only, "He wants to speak with you." No explanation was offered. The line clicked, like a professional curtain being drawn, the kind that separates the private that is prepared for public consumption from the private that remains private. Jian took a breath and looked at Jian. "Whatever he says," she whispered, "we speak as a team." They rehearsed, not lines but stances, not desperate, not vindictive. They had learned what dignity looked like under pressure. It was not a grand gesture, but a steady refusal to be diminished. And yet, as the world prepared for the announcement that would read in thousands of fonts and colors, "CEO calls off wedding," they felt the thin hum of something else: possibility. A cancellation could be an end or a beginning. It could be the move that protected them from further exposure, or the catalyst that forced them to build their own definitions of success beyond somebody's surname. The cameras were already out when Shishang made his decision. Reporters had filled the hallways, the glow of cell phones making the moment look like a constellation. The family gathered like characters in a play, waiting for the next cue. But the truth is, decisions are made in rooms that few ever see. In boardrooms where lawyers whisper, in private office windows where executives weigh traction against turmoil, in late-night phone calls between two people who once promised each other forever. And while the world braced for a spectacle, Jian and Jian prepared for whatever came next, not because they desired publicity, but because they had learned the hard way that public narratives, once set in motion, rarely give you back your story unless you take it. They had stitched their defenses out of evidence: CCTV footage, metadata reports, payment trails, raw files. They had textured their bravery with small acts of normalcy: a bowl of broth shared with a sister, a sketch pinned to a wall. Their plan was simple: show proof, step forward, and reclaim their narrative, whether that meant making the wedding a symbol of resilience or letting it dissolve into something clearer and stronger. As the hour approached for the public statement that everyone whispered about, when the headline would break and social feeds would flare, they filed one more piece of evidence into the council's folder. It was a string of messages between a freelance photographer and an unknown client, the kind of exchange that, when connected to the payment chain, could unravel the entire operation of the smear campaign. The final click of the upload button felt like closing a circle. It also felt like opening a new one. The sisters had done what they could. Now the world would decide how to read it. And then the press conference began. Lights, microphones, a single podium. The cameras leaned forward like predators. The room waited for the moment that, in time, would be printed under the headline everyone had already rehearsed in their heads: CEO calls off wedding. The lights hit like a strip of white truth. Microphones leaned forward. Reporters blinked into the glare, thumbs poised, cameras whirring as if they could press the air into headlines. Zhao Shizang stepped up to the podium with the quiet gravity of someone who has rehearsed every possible phrasing until the shape of the inevitable felt like fate. He did not mince words. Given the recent events and the harm they've caused to people I care about, my family, my colleagues, and especially Jian, I've decided to call off the wedding, he said, each syllable measured. I will be stepping back from any plans that would turn this private pain into public spectacle. The room exhaled as if a fuse had been snuffed. Cheers, gasps, the instant choreography of a press corps rearranging the narrative. Some journalists reached for their notes as though the sentence were the main event. The headline had already been written in thousands of minds. CEO calls off wedding.
Then something unexpected happened. Where most scripts imagine a bride reduced to a single frame, sobbing, begging, dissolving into paper towels, Jian moved with a different rhythm. She did not fall apart. She did not hurl accusations into microphones. She walked forward with the same steady steps she took down runways, the same focused, almost surgical composure she brought to fittings when every stitch mattered. She had a statement prepared, but it wasn't the kind the cameras expected. Instead of a plea, she gave a charge. "Thank you," she said, voice clear against the murmuring. "Mr. Zhou, thank you for trying to protect us, but protection is not the same as power. I will not be sheltered from public life by being hidden away behind an apology, nor will I be used as a balm to soothe a corporate image when that image must also answer for its mistakes." There was a hush that felt like an intake of collective breath. Jian Yue's words landed the way a well-cut silhouette lands on a runway, immediately understood by anyone who had eyes for structure. "And so," she continued, "we will not let the cancellation be an endpoint. It will be a pivot. Effective immediately, I will be redirecting the wedding budget to a fund to support small creative businesses harmed by smear campaigns. I will also be formalizing a partnership with the Zhou family to secure minority equity and governance protections for my brand, terms that make independence permanent, not performative." Reporters blinked at each other, unsure whether to transcribe a speech or a manifesto. The phrase minority equity and governance protections landed like a gavel. It read suddenly like a contract as much as a pronouncement, something with legal teeth, not just sentiment. Xizhan listened impassively, but the flush at his jaw betrayed a private turbulence. This was not the tear-soaked tableau the tabloids had banked on. This was a woman reclaiming the narrative so decisively that the cancellation, once a dramatic finale, had become the opening line of a new contract. Jian lifted a folder, the same collection of documents the sisters had spent sleepless nights assembling, and turned it outward so cameras could catch a glimpse of live verifiable evidence. There were screenshots of raw files, a forensic analyst summary with timestamps, payment chains, and a list of the intermediaries who'd bought the story. "We also have proof that the images and the live stream were part of a coordinated campaign," she said. "We will cooperate fully with law enforcement. We will not weaponize pain for clicks. We will ask for accountability, not vengeance." It was a neat, firm conclusion. She stepped back, and for a heartbeat the world tilted at a new angle. Instead of the bride's collapse, the public saw an operative who translated indignity into ordinance, terms, documents, a path forward. The reaction online was immediate and jagged. The first wave of commentary debated the phrasing.
The second wave debated the optics, but the third wave, the one that matters, started changing the story. Social feeds that had for weeks gorged on suspicion now fed on something more digestible, a comeback. Within hours, legal teams moved. Zhou Group's counsel confirmed that internal discussions were underway about a formal strategic investment into Jian label,
an agreement that would include not only capital, but transferable equity and a seat at the table for governance decisions, protections meant to prevent takeover by any single external force. It was the kind of arrangement that said this was not a rescue, it was a rebalancing. The press conference did two things at once. Xi Zhang's decision to call off the wedding satisfied a very public expectation. He had performed a clean, dramatic choice. Jian Ye's response reframed that drama. Instead of a pitiful bride, the cameras now focused on an architect. What followed was the slow, methodical unspooling of the smear campaign the dossiers had exposed. Investigators who had been quietly collecting data accelerated subpoenas. The payment trails the sisters' digital forensics team had unearthed converged with accounts the police had traced for ransom and livestream coordination. The petty thug who had played the masked role in the livestream turned state's witness. His testimony led investigators to a small PR shop with a history of creative solutions and a list of contractors willing to operate in ethically gray zones. Lin Xiaoye's name surfaced again, but this time with a context that complicated the headlines. Her bank records showed transfers from an account tied to a middleman who was already under investigation. When questioned, Lin produced a set of messages showing threats and blackmail, someone who had leveraged an old and private relationship in order to extort her into compliance. She had been squeezed between fear of exposure and a perceived offer of quick cash. The moral clarity of a single villain evaporated into a pattern of exploitation, a woman coerced, intermediaries motivated by clicks, and a campaign designed to destabilize rather than destroy outright. The police moved to arrest the studio's owner, the person who brokered those contacts, and later a small team of operatives who had knowingly helped manufacture the material that became the viral lie. Charges were filed: fraud, coercion, unlawful distribution of manipulated materials, and the livestream harassment-linked counts that matched the ransom stunt. The legal press still had far more to say, but the framework was clear. The smear was not an accident, it had been a plan. Public apologies trickled out from a few outlets that had posted the manipulated photo with rigorous verification. The original blogger who'd had the most retweeted thread issued a halting regret that read like someone afraid of admitting they'd fed the machine.
Some influencers who'd amplified the story quietly deleted posts that had smeared the sisters. In the meantime, Jian Yu's runway victory, an act of defiance staged weeks before, but that had ballooned into symbolic currency, became a central piece of the counter-narrative. The footage of her walking the show with her own face and her own clothes had already played in rotational loops across feeds by the time the police announced arrests. Buyers who had been hesitant now called to finalize terms. The international deal, the one that would ensure distribution across 5 new markets, went from conditional to concrete. Not everything reset instantly. There were consequences to weather, canceled reservations to repair, contractual clauses to negotiate, strained family ties to soothe. Mother's angina remained fragile, flaring in nights heavy with anxiety, but the pressure that had choked her lessened as the smoke of rumor dissipated. Auntie, who had once pushed for the red carpet narrative, spent a restless week moving between contrition and the old habit of over-curation. She attended press calls in a kind of miserable penance, and while she couldn't erase the barbed choices she'd made, she began to realign with the sisters' new posture: dignity, not spectacle. Xiang, whose first instinct had been to scold and attempt to control, found himself in a different place. The impulsive racer had a rage that now bent into protective humility. He apologized more than once, awkwardly, with engine rev metaphors and foil-wrapped concern. He accompanied investigators on a few logistical errands, and his presence, previously a furnace of impatience, cooled into something more useful, a broker of quick favors and late-night talks. It was clumsy redemption, but redemption nonetheless. And then there was the quiet political calculus at Show Group. Board members and PR councils whispered about stock stability and brand integrity. To some, it made no strategic sense to gift equity to the aggrieved party. To others, the move Jian Yu had proposed, an investment with governance safeguards, was a shrewd way to secure long-term goodwill and to anchor the relationship in contract rather than spectacle. An equity transfer, articulated as an investment in creative talent and protected by minority rights clauses, would stop any future rumors from gaining traction through ownership conflicts. It would also, in a very modern way, say that the company recognized the harm it had suffered in association with its leadership, and it would make a structural amends rather than a bouquet of perfunctory apologies. Executives moved with a corporate deliberateness that was a strange echo of the sisters' own craft-based patience. Term sheets were drafted, countersigned, and reworked until the tilt of the deal felt equitable. Jian Yu insisted on direct oversight and a clause that required public retractions be binding, not optional.
The Zhao family elders, watching the shape of the public sentiment shift,
chose to make the transfer in a moment that felt almost formal, an announcement that said the company would invest in talent rather than simply salvage an image. The press spun a dozen theories about motives and outcomes. Some op-eds praised this as a new model. When a scandal hits, the correct move is not to hide, but to build structures that prevent future misuse. Others sniffed that the move was transactional, the kind of compromise power always favors. Jian read both and shrugged, as if shrugging were a tiny domestic miracle. For her, the math was simple. A deal that gave the brand capital and protection enabled her to design without fear of hostile takeover. It was autonomy that mattered more than headlines. Meanwhile, the courtroom proceedings and police investigations continued their slow, granular work. Lin Xiaoyou's disclosures painted a fuller portrait, someone desperate enough to accept an offer that promised silence, then frightened by the scope of what she had been asked to do. She cooperated. Her testimony helped map the payment chain to a PR coordinator who had sold the smear as a creative activation. The PR coordinator was not a media mogul with infinite resources, but a man with connections, contracts, and a loose moral compass. He had sold a storyline. He had not thought it would incur criminal charges. That miscalculation changed the texture of the story from conspiracy-laden fiction to a case study in irresponsible opportunism. In public, Jian never shouted victory from rooftops. She stayed measured, issuing requests for empathy toward anyone coerced of the participation, while demanding accountability for those who had knowingly orchestrated harm. That balance, firm but humane, made it harder for commentators to reduce her to a one-note figure. It made her admixture of rage and mercy into something complex and oddly compelling. A week after the press conference, after legal filings and board meetings and the small rituals that mark corporate life, the sisters hosted a modest dinner. It was not a wedding, nor a wake. It was a regathering. The table was small, steam curling from bowls Jian had prepared, comfort food that had always been political in its generosity. Shizette attended, not as a man trying to buy absolution, but as someone trying to find a place in the new arrangement he had helped precipitate. He and Jian talked quietly at the end of the table, the conversation private but not furtive. When they emerged, the world observed a scene that had the dignity of people who had been through a storm and survived it. "I should have done more sooner," he told reporters later, the candor of the line making the rounds. "I made a choice that I thought would protect. I now understand protection can look like support that preserves dignity." There was no melodramatic reconciliation broadcast with orchestral swells. There was instead an agreement drawn up and signed, an investment in a creative company, governance protections for minority shareholders, and a public promise of ethical audits on how the company handled media relations. It was business in the form of reparation. The fallout for the smear operators continued apace. The PR coordinator and the studio owner faced charges for their roles in the manipulated photos and the livestream. The masked man who'd been the visible face of the kidnapping received plea offers in exchange for testimony. The legal story was dense and wonky to the point of boredom for many viewers, but the principle remained. Manipulation for clicks had legal and reputational costs now, and the sisters' insistence on documentation and evidence had translated personal pain into institutional consequences. There were smaller, tenderer victories, too. Jian's restaurant regained clientele as apologies and retractions cleared the web. A city health inspector retracted a rumor-driven complaint after reviewing records and stated publicly that the restaurant met all standards. The pop-up collaboration with a celebrity chef opened to lines around the block. Food writers who had once hesitated now wrote columns praising the broth's clarity and the kitchen's warmth. Where bad publicity had once had the power to sink small ventures, measured responses and professional testimony had begun to blunt that power. Then, in the moment that would be replayed in a softer light than the press had previously shown, the Zhu family matriarch took a stand. She called Mother, Jian and Jian's mother, into a private room, and with an old woman's economy of words, handed over a small packet of papers. They were not legal fireworks. They were, in practical terms, a partial transfer of trust-held shares, an allocation the matriarch said she wanted the sisters to hold in their own names, to cement a financial independence that could weather the storms of rumor. "Enough of these outsiders telling you who you are," the matriarch said. "Keep what is yours." The gesture was quietly seismic. It was not a dramatic, televised gift, though a photograph later did circulate of the two women holding cups of tea in the packet between them, but it mattered more than any headline. For the sisters, it represented a kind of legitimacy that was not conferred by marriage, but earned by craft and endurance.
As the legal dust settled and the deals formalized, the sisters found space for quieter, personal things. Jian began to speak of a future in terms that included a new, surprising chapter. Late one evening, at the same small kitchen table where they had stitched together plans through thick and thin, she reached across the worn wood and placed her hand on Jian. "There's something I haven't said," she told her sister. The revelation was small and luminous. She was pregnant. The news rippled differently through the group. It was not a publicity beat.
It was a small life, tender and private, that opened new possibilities. It reframed the cancellation for some people, not as a failure of romance, but as a clearing that allowed other kinds of family to grow. For the sisters, it felt like the return of something ordinary, a secret, a future, messy and hopeful. They celebrated with a modest meal, a few close friends, and a photographer who took their picture in a sunlit courtyard later that week. The photograph that circulated afterward, the one that would become the final image of the saga, was not glamorous in the way tabloids anticipated. It was a family photo, the sisters arm in arm, mother smiling behind them, the matriarch of the Zhou family slightly to the side, Zhang and Yang standing with tentative warmth, and the aunt with a look of complicated pride. It was a photograph that told a more layered truth, that scandal can break a body of narrative, but cannot necessarily unmake the relationships people stitch back together. The brand's new distribution deal launched on schedule. Sales reports the next quarter showed a measurable uptick, not simply a sympathy surge, but the durable interest of customers drawn to quality combined with a narrative of resilience. Jian built a new governance framework into her company that included a small board seat for a consumer rights advocate, a choice she made to ensure that trust was not a transactional thing, but structural. There were still critics who argued that the sisters had danced too elegantly with power, or that the Zhou family had used money to buy a narrative. There were still legal hearings and depositions that made for dry news coverage. But the fundamental arc of the story had shifted away from spectacle and towards something replicable: evidence-based defense, strategic negotiation, and an insistence on agency. Months later, when the court appearances had slowed and the headlines had turned elsewhere, a modest gallery in town displayed a small installation documenting the responses to the smear campaign, a timeline of screenshots, a forensic report, and a recorded interview with the people coerced into participation. It functioned as a public service, a curated reminder that manipulation has costs and that patterns of coercion can be exposed. On a quiet afternoon not long after, the sisters sat in Jian's kitchen testing a new broth recipe, laughing at a story about a misfired model booking from a season ago. There was a lightness between them that had been difficult to find in the weeks of accusation and legal wrangling. Fragile, yes, and earned. Zhang and Jian met privately once more, not before cameras, but behind closed doors with counsel present. They spoke frankly about missteps and expectations, about what protection meant to each of them. Their conversation ended not with a statement for the press, but with an understanding. If they were to be together in any future, it would be as partners, with explicit, mutual responsibilities, no longer a savior patriarch and dependent, but equals at a table where documents would govern affection the way they governed investments. The world would later piece the arc into digestible beats. CEO calls off wedding, bride refuses pity, sisters win comeback, PR operators charged, family reconciles. But the truth lived in smaller scenes: nights of drafting contracts until dawn, a forensic analyst's weary satisfaction at closing a chain of proof, a matriarch's surprising generosity, a tiny heartbeat heard in a quiet room. The last public image of the saga, later shared by magazines that had once spread the manipulated photos, was a family picture taken in early spring. The sisters stood together, shoulders aligned, smiles calm and not smug. Jian's hand rested lightly on the swell of her lower belly, and the matriarch's fingers hovered above it like a benediction. Zhang looked on with an expression that had shed some of its earlier polish and replaced it with humility. Even the aunt's face had softened into something like contrition and fondness. They were not the kind of family that pointed cameras cattily at each other. They were a family that had learned to stitch a broader net: legal safeguards, shared investments, new business structures, and a tiny human life about to enter the world. The cancellation of the wedding had been the pivot everyone expected to be a finale. Instead, it became the seam along which a new, self-determined life was sown. Months after the headlines cooled, critics still debated whether the sisters should have handled things differently. Supporters argued that the moral was clear: dignity can be defended with documents as well as with defiance.
In small corners of the internet, people mapped the case as a cautionary tale about digital manipulation. In storefronts and studio lofts, small-time designers and restaurateurs mentioned the sisters' names as examples of how to weather storms without becoming storms themselves. And in the kitchen where it had all started, where bones had simmered into stock and where designs had first been traced on cheap paper, the sisters planned a modest celebration. Not a wedding, not a resignation, but a gathering that honored the people who had stayed. Friends, workers, quiet supporters, and a handful of journalists who had done their jobs well. They posed for another photograph that night, this one snapped by Jian Shin's longtime manager on a battered phone. It was less composed than the professional shot in spring, more candid, more laugh-lined. Someone told a bad joke about a botched caramel and everyone laughed until their faces hurt. The camera caught a momentary tilt of ease, two sisters who had been pulled through the fire and came out stubbornly whole.
When the story finally settled into the quieter pages of culture, examined in op-eds, law review notes, and a few think pieces on corporate accountability, it was clear that the headline that had started it all, CEO calls off wedding, had been only half the truth. The decision had been public and dramatic, yes, and it had shaped the optics. But the real shock the world had not seen coming was not that the wedding was canceled. It was that the woman at its center had turned the cancellation into a ladder. She didn't collapse into pity. She translated humiliation into governance and made independence a line item. She took a moment designed to erase her and turned it into a new portrait, an entrepreneur, a sister, a maker, and soon a mother. The CEOs and PR operatives had expected performance. Instead, they encountered architecture, contracts, evidence, and a refusal to be defined by someone else's narrative. If there was a final moral, it wasn't an easy one. Power can be used to soothe or to silence. It can also be pressed into the service of repair. The sisters chose repair, with clauses, with business plans, with a public record and a small, tender life growing quietly among them. The cancellation remained factual, the reaction stamped into memory. People had come expecting melodrama and left with something more useful, a lesson in how dignity, once stripped, can be rebuilt into structures that protect not just one person, but many. So when the tabloids eventually scanned their headlines and recycled the flashier beats, the sisters had already moved on to the next work table. Dresses were being designed, soup was simmering, and a tiny private future was beginning to feel possible in a way it hadn't when the cameras first blinked on. Which part of the story surprised you the most? The CEO's public call to cancel, or the way Jian turned that cancellation into a platform for power? Share your thoughts below, and if you want more long-form stories about unexpected comebacks, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next one.